My question is to the Prime Minister. 8 days into the Sydney outbreak, the Prime Minister congratulated the New South Wales Premier for not locking down. 2 months later, the whole of New South Wales is in extended lockdown and a record 919 new cases today, and the outbreak has spread to Victoria, the ACT and even New Zealand. New South Wales hospitals are at breaking point. Will the Prime Minister accept his complacency contributed to the current circumstances?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 23rd of August, the Leader of the Opposition was opposing the national plan. He pretends today he was supporting it. Now, Mr Speaker...
I'll just say to the Prime Minister that the question wasn't about the national plan. Prime Minister has the call. It needs to be relevant. Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting, as will the member for Franklin. Prime Minister needs to be relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The situation in New South Wales is of course, intensely serious. It is incredibly serious, Mr Speaker. And that situation, Mr Speaker, is a function of one thing, the Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus, Mr Speaker. Those opposite might like to think that Australia is somehow immune to a global pandemic, Mr Speaker. Perhaps they think that the fault of there being a lockdown in New Zealand is the fault of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, or the outbreak in the United Kingdom or in the Netherlands, Mr Speaker, or other parts of the world, Mr Speaker, is the function of those leaders, Mr Speaker. But what sensible people understand, Mr Speaker, is that what we are going through is a global pandemic. And in this country, Mr Speaker, country, Mr Speaker, the actions of the government, together with governments around the country, has saved 30,000 lives, and 1 million people, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, are back in work. And what I note this year, Mr Speaker, because I remember last year very vividly, when Melbourne, Mr Speaker, was going through the lockdown.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It was a specific question about whether the Prime Minister accepted any responsibility.
The point of order is on relevance, I presume.
Well, do you understand?
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the House will cease their conversation. The point of order is on relevance, I take it.
Is on relevance, Mr Speaker. The question went to whether there was any responsibility for the fact that the Prime Minister encouraged and congratulated the New South Wales Premier for not taking action
to the Leader of the Opposition,
against the pandemic. He
doesn't need to restate the question. No, he doesn't need to restate it. That's the last thing he needs to do. When the Leader of the Opposition says it was a very specific question, it was a very specific question at the end of a very long preamble. That doesn't open the question up entirely, but I'm listening to the Prime Minister to ensure he's being relevant to the question. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, all premiers, all chief ministers, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, others, have had to make many decisions over the course of this pandemic. And collectively, those decisions, Mr Speaker, have saved 30,000 lives in this country, something envied by countries all around the world. And we have an economy, Mr Speaker, that remains incredibly resilient, and 1 million people, Mr Speaker, coming back into work after the COVID-19 recession last year. Those are the decisions that governments have been taking, and they are the results that are being achieved. Now, the Delta variant, as we know, completely changed everything in terms of our COVID response. And, Mr Speaker, the New South Wales government made decisions, Mr Speaker, and have been making decisions over the course of this pandemic. And on previous occasions, they have made decisions where they haven't locked down, which enable children to still go to school. Mr Speaker, where enable businesses to remain open and avoid the great hardship of the lockdowns, which cause terrible ruin on people, Mr Speaker. These lockdowns are hard to endure. They are necessary at this time, Mr Speaker, but only as long as they need to be. And the New South Wales government has sought to avoid those lockdowns, Mr Speaker, over the course of this pandemic. Mr Speaker. Now, those opposite may want to charge in and attack the New South Wales government for their efforts. They may seek to do that, Mr Speaker. I am not going to do that. What I know is last year What I know is last year, Mr Speaker, over 800 lives were lost in Victoria. This year in New South Wales, 76 have been lost. We are making great progress in fighting this pandemic, and I thank all the premiers for their